It seems that music has always been around. It wasn't invented any more than was fire and water. Did someone invent the singing voice? Did someone invent the thump on a log? As such things were discovered, people harnessed the sounds and put them to work. Like speech, music communicates. Like poetry, music evokes. How sounds are assembled to accomplish a purpose results from a civilization's needs and values. So music of a specific time and place gives us entry into the people to whom it belonged. Music also connects us to our emotions, providing additional unique insight. Music and its place in history is a series in 14 episodes, each 45 minutes in length. Its aim is to be a primer, or an overview, of music throughout history, offering an infinite number of triggers that could inspire more research and study. The first episode covered antiquity, from the earliest time to about 500 AD, which marks the beginning of the Middle Ages. We looked at evidence indicating that, throughout the millennia before the Common Era, music had been part of human life, and that each civilization seems to have learned from the earlier civilizations. Because music was passed down generation to generation in mostly an oral tradition, we have to guess a lot about how the music sounded. As we go into the Middle Ages, we gain many more reliable clues. The Middle Ages, or medieval in Latin, are so named because simply this is the middle period between antiquity and modern times. The Middle Ages spanned from 500 to 1450, or nearly 1,000 years, and can be broken down into three periods: early, high, and late. Let's review how we got here. In 117 AD, the Roman Empire, with its capital in Rome, governed the entire perimeter of the Mediterranean, including North Africa and the Arabian ports on both the Mediterranean and Red Seas, all of Turkey, Mesopotamia and up around the Black Sea to the Caucasus, the southern part of Eastern Europe, and the western part of Europe, including much of Britain. Between 100 and 500 AD, the period known as the Migrations eventually resulted in the weakening of the entire empire. The Roman Empire was divided into East and West. The Western Empire embraced Latin and Roman heritage. The Western Empire ended in 476 when the emperor was deposed. Over the following centuries, society there turned more and more intensely toward the Catholic Church, the most important part of Roman civilization that remained in the West. The Eastern, or Byzantine Empire, included the areas of Greece and the areas around the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, and modern-day Turkey. The Eastern Roman Empire embraced the Greek heritage and helped to preserve that history and knowledge through the Middle Ages. The Eastern Christian Church evolved along lines that were more Greek than Roman and became known as the Orthodox Church. The Eastern Empire continued on into the early Middle Ages. Constantinople replaced Rome as the whole area's cultural center. Antiquity's monuments ranged from massive, elaborate tombs and temples to the ruins of great cities of mythology and learning. The monuments of the Middle Ages often looked more like these. Clockwise from the top left. Notre Dame, Paris, from the 12th and 13th centuries. An Islamic mosque in India, from the 11th century. Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, 6th century. Chartres in France, from the 12th and 13th centuries. A Buddhist temple in Burma, from the 10th century. And Aachen, Germany, in the 9th and 10th centuries. We need to talk about religion for a moment. In ancient times, religion and mythology were basically the same. Religion was used to champion harmony within communities. Any society, even now, needs to promote peace within it and encourage reliance among members of the community. Reliance, religion. Religion, literature. The etymology of the word suggests that its purpose is to bind and connect us together. Hinduism is one of the world's oldest religions that is still practiced today. Keeping order in society is the paramount purpose. There are many gods involved in Hinduism, but they all serve and reflect aspects of one supreme being, the Brahma. The belief is that every individual has a specific place in the order of the universe. Each person has a duty to serve well in that assigned place. That's the Dharma. And adhering to its rightness is one's karma. If successful in one's duty, one is rewarded by moving closer to the Supreme Being. In Buddhism, one is not trying to achieve proximity to the Supreme Being as much as striving for one's better self, thereby attaining freedom from suffering and fear. Ancient Chinese religions were often a mix of animism and mythology, giving us such symbols as the famous Chinese dragon. And then the two great philosophers, Confucius and Lao Tzu, lived in the 6th century BC, giving rise to Confucianism and Taoism. In places like Egypt, Greece, and the Roman Empire, belief in many gods served to help people grasp what was often not very well understood, like the creation of the world or humans' place in the world. Most religions try to answer the question, what happens after death? And for many of the various religions of antiquity, the theory varied from blistering hell to life just goes on as is, and in some religions, blissful heaven was promised. Polytheism was standard in antiquity. Many gods were needed to grapple with the moon, the stars, the earth, the harvest, and all the various joys and miseries of life. In cities and communities, temple complexes were built as the literal homes of gods. The temples became central to people's lives in the cities, feeding the poor, counseling, providing medical services, and in some cases, staging grand festivals. Monotheism just didn't make sense for most people of the ancient world. There were some exceptions, of course. Most notably, there were the visionaries and prophets of Judaism. The Jews lived in the territory between Egypt and Mesopotamia. They followed the Old Testament of the Bible, in which a single God asked Abraham to leave Ur to found a new nation in Canaan. Abraham was important in the lineage of prophets whose stories and teachings are bound to this area of the Middle East. Jesus was a Jewish prophet whose teaching resulted in the New Testament and is the basis of the Christian faith. At the end of the 6th century AD, Muhammad was a prophet whose Quran instituted rituals for understanding the supreme deity and served to provide Islamic answers to humanity's perpetual questions about life and death. These three religions that developed from the Abraham story, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, established monotheism as a new standard. Judaism dates back to the 3rd or 4th millennium BC, but it was mostly practiced devoutly and quietly by a focused group of believers. But in the first few centuries AD, Christianity was like a wildfire in Europe and the Middle East. These new single-God believers were perceived as a threat and were viewed with distrust and suspicion. Persecutions were legal and even encouraged. Policies didn't calm down until after 313, when Emperor Constantine decreed that the Christians should be tolerated. Perhaps it's notable that Constantine's decree fell short of saying that all religious beliefs should be equally tolerated. the idea faded that religion is principally about providing order for the whole of a society. Instead, religion bound people together by faith. Those outside that faith were the other. In the Middle Ages, a new reality of religious zealotry and jealousy gets the better of Europe and the Middle East. The people who lived elsewhere, like the Buddhists and the Taoists, may have been sadly dismayed to see what was going on, if they were watching. During the early Middle Ages, the established religions, such as Judaism, Hinduism, and ancient Roman polytheism, were ingrained in the culture. Then by 600 A.D., the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, had spread Christianity throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea. 100 years later, in 700 A.D., Islam had joined the world's religions, and its influence was spreading quickly and with force. On this map for 750 A.D., the light mustard color is all that's left of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Muslim Empire, or Caliphate, depicted in the light olive green, stretched throughout the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, across northern Africa and into Spain. The remainder of Western Europe is labeled here as the Lombards, the Franks, the Basques and Asturias of northern Spain, and the people of the British Isles. These independent territories and kingdoms were comparatively disorganized, and they were boxed in by the more powerful entities to the west, south, and east. Therefore, the culture of Western Europe went into incubation and developed along distinct lines. With so much uncertainty, poverty, and existential risk in these societies, the Roman Catholic Church, perhaps willingly, perhaps out of desperation and necessity, became the most important source of stability, education, and economy in all of the areas remaining under its influence. There was a brief period of stability in France. Charlemagne's Carolingian Renaissance united the areas of France and Germany and purposefully assisted economic life and the arts during the 800s. Charlemagne was crowned emperor of the new Holy Roman Empire, which was essentially a coalition. While the Carolingian Empire didn't last long, it did provide impetus for musical developments north of the Alps, and the loose organization of the Holy Roman Empire continued to exist in various guises into the 1800s. The Crusades were a main feature of the High Middle Ages. They were a series of campaigns to regain Christian control over the Holy Lands. They also expanded the territory of Christianity again, and a greater feeling of prosperity and security developed in Europe. This was good for Europe, but these religious conquests were brutal. History shows us that they were imperial in nature. Nobles sought to recapture lands they lost to Islam, and they solicited the Pope's assistance. The Pope was not just a church leader at this point. He'd become a recognized member of the ruling class, and people responded passionately to the call to arms in God's name. The Crusades didn't come to an end until the Pope lost such power. During the late Middle Ages of 1200 to 1450, Europe would again be troubled by disease, unrest, and wars prior to the beginning of the Renaissance. An outbreak of the plague wiped out anywhere from 30 to 70% of the European population. Now, let's get to the music. The Roman Catholic Church's territory of influence was very much reduced from the time of the Roman Empire, but it was still significant. How do you, from your seat in Rome, serve people as far away as northern France? How do you make it possible to spread your mission far and wide, yet maintain authority over your message? In its effort to accomplish these challenges, the Church invented strategies that ended up accelerating Western musical evolution. The oral traditions of folk music and music for dance, ceremony, and entertainment continued unabated from antiquity. The Church, however, saw music's purpose very differently. They wanted music to be the ultimate messenger between heaven and earth. They looked to the Greeks for inspiration on such things, borrowing their philosophy and theory. Therefore, the Greek musical modes and the Church modes are similar in some of their features and names, but they're not really the same. Pope Gregory I was Pope of the Church in the late 6th century. He codified the liturgy and assigned melodies the Church should use for various liturgical purposes. He gathered music that perhaps was well known to people already, and he wrote some of his own. This body of music is known as Gregorian chant. To help churches in different locations teach or remind the clergy of the melodies, a basic notation was used to indicate features of the tunes. During the years of the Carolingian Renaissance, Charlemagne assisted the Church in their efforts, so by the 9th century an organized body of Gregorian chant was quite uniformly used. The notation was at first fairly simple. Neumes, which were merely graphic shapes, indicated pitch direction and characteristics. By the 13th century, a 4-line staff was in use. A basic clef sign at the beginning of the staff indicated which line was to be the pitch C. The neumes became more note-shaped, and the position increased the specificity of pitch direction, rhythm, and other characteristics. Here we see the same chant in the various stages of early notation. The bottom line is the same chant in modern notation. The modern notation is, in fact, too precise. Chant is usually performed quite free rhythmically, with a flowing meter, pace, and phrasing. Gregorian chant is monophonic. No accompaniment was intended. The ideal sound for the Church was just the voice. Guido of Arezzo was a monk and music theorist who is credited with establishing the musical notation of note heads and staff. To aid the ability to read the notation and to hear the pitch relationships, he employed hexachords and used syllables derived from a well-known hymn that became our familiar solfege system of do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. A graphic device called the Guidonian hand was developed to teach music reading and sight singing, using parts of the hand to represent pitches. Now that music could be more or less accurately notated, one could learn music without having to hear it first. Now there was a way to ensure that a chant or a hymn would be essentially the same in one locale or another, and not substantially changed from one generation to the next. A Catholic church service was a somber affair, with the choir and congregation singing parts of the service in monophonic chant and the cantor intoning the rest. Intonation means to speak on a sung pitch. The high services, such as Mass, were sung throughout, alternating between intonation and chant.
Dominus vobiscum, et cum spiritu tuo. Oremus, exali nos omnipotens et misericors Deus, ut quod nostro ministrator officio, tuo benedictione portius impleatur, per Dominum nostrum Iesum Christum Filium tuum, qui tecum vivit et regnat in unitatis Spiritus Sancti Deus, per omnia saecula saeculorum. Amen.
As you can imagine, as heavenly as this monophonic singing may have sounded in a reverberant cathedral, one might hope for variety now and then. The solution came in the form of enhancements like tropes, antiphons, and extra hymns that were added to the service. It didn't replace anything in the service, it made the affair longer. As an example, if the priest's line was Kyrie eleison, meaning, O God, have mercy upon us, with a trope the line might become, O God, creator of all things, most benevolent God, have mercy upon us. It means the same thing, but it is enhanced and serves to add extra emotion. It isn't dissimilar to a pop singer now who greatly embellishes a simple melodic line for emotional effect. Antiphons were used to illuminate the meaning or to provide context for a psalm reading. Antiphons were often given glorious antiphonal settings, in which two choirs would take turns singing from opposite sides of the church. Another kind of embellishment was the liturgical drama, which would use music, acting, and perhaps costumes and scenery to depict a biblical story. Such things were not part of the codified liturgy. They were added entertainment that served a sacred purpose. We have our first evidence of polyphony coming out of Notre Dame in Paris in the 12th century. If monophony is one melody only, polyphony means more than one melody simultaneously. We shouldn't assume that polyphony wasn't already prevalent. It was probably part of all music already, but with notation we begin to see documentation through composition, and therefore we can see its evolution. The first phase was parallel organum, that is, a piece of music in which a second melody shadows the first in parallel motion. Free organum came later, and probably developed through a bit of experimentation and improvisation. It means the two melodies moved in directions independent of one another. Many notes to a single note of the original chant is called melismatic organum or florid organum. The original chant, which could still serve as the impetus, is now known as the cantus firmus or fixed song. The chant was probably well known to everyone in the congregation, but it was transferred to a role in the background while the embellishment of added voices moved prominently in the foreground. The cantus firmus, that is, the original chant, took on a structural function, so often it was barely recognizable as a tune. The musical interest was with the added voice or voices, which may have been given the extra enhancement of a rhythmic mode as well. Chances are that composers' musical imaginations were far ahead of the procedures for transferring musical ideas into notation. Certainly by the end of the 13th century, notation had evolved enough to enable composers to write extensive polyphony. The term motet has over time come to mean any piece of vocal music with a sacred intent that is not part of the regular liturgy. Countless composers have written motets over the centuries. In the 13th century, however, a motet seems to have been experimental and sometimes playful as a composition. Such a motet might be used in church, or it might not be intended for use in church. It might use a cantus firmus, or it might not. Secular motets became increasingly common through the 13th century. Sacred motets would have used a Latin text. Secular motets would have been in the vernacular, in this case, French. Often motets had two or more texts, juxtaposed in the parts. The texts usually were related in some way, such as providing commentary to one another or providing two sides to an argument. Some 13th century motets used both Latin and French simultaneously. And because the motet was not confined to the church, instruments often performed along with or in place of vocal parts. Music beyond the church was common. By the 11th century, literacy among the population was improving. A form of poetic entertainment for the upper class was from the troubadour in southern France and the trouvère in northern France. These were writers and singers of secular songs of courtly love, chivalry, and politics. They would perform their songs and perhaps accompany themselves with a lute or another instrument. Many musical instruments were in use in the Middle Ages, most having been carried forth from antiquity. Some of them are pictured in this miniature about Roman de Favre, the satirical poem from the early 14th century. We can assume that instruments were common accompaniment for song and dance, and that the rhythms of folk traditions and instrumental performance were probably much more vivid than what was yet possible in notation. This music probably stood in stark contrast to the music of the church. Here is an estampie, a dance piece that is laid out in clear phrase pairs, each punctuated with a brief refrain. In the medieval period, there wasn't yet the thought that someone would be a composer. Instead, we think of people as contributing to music's development. Pope Gregory contributed some chants, but how original they were is well beyond the point. At Notre Dame, contributions of early organum were written down by composers Leonan and his student Peritan. They were working as choir masters and teachers toward the end of the High Middle Ages. We probably wouldn't know about them at all if it weren't for an anonymous student's treatise written 100 years after the fact. Their work was significant, however, providing workable methods to notate simultaneous melodies in structures of rhythm and meter. There is Hildegard von Bingen, 1098 to 1179. She was a Benedictine abbess who wrote a lot of text and contributed new melodies and polyphony to the repertoire of the medieval church. She was important in diverse fields as well, including art, medicine, natural sciences, and theology. Two centuries after Hildegard, in the 14th century, Guillaume de Machaut, 1300 to 1377, is the first person whose biography is clearly that of a professional composer. During his life, he was employed by courts, kings, and popes. The majority of Machaut's output is secular French poetry and music, but he also wrote sacred music with Latin texts. Machaut is probably most famous for his complete setting of the Mass Ordinary. The Mass Ordinary is comprised of the 5 sections of the Mass that are the same throughout the liturgical year: Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and Agnus Dei. Machaut's setting is the first known composition to treat the whole Mass Ordinary in one large-scale design. Each section of the Mass begins with a single-line chant. It is a statement of the original chant melody. It goes on to be used as a cantus firmus, as the basis for the polyphony that follows. The recordings usually are with voice only, no instruments, although by this point it could happen that instruments may have been heard playing or doubling vocal parts. Machaut's music does sound medieval. Sometimes the harmony may sound meandering to our ears. And the phrase endings, at which we especially expect functional harmony, may come across as strident. This isn't to say that Machaut's music is less beautiful and effective. But at this stage in history, music was not yet operating according to modern theoretical practices. Those are yet to come. Machaut survived the Black Death. It must have been devastating to see so many of his patrons, friends, and family perish through the catastrophe. It isn't until the beginning of the Renaissance that music development again accelerates.